What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Axioms on Trial. I am your host, Mike, and my co-host, Cease to Know, always besides me. How you doing, brother?
Great. How you doing?
I'm great, man. I'm excited for this one. This one's going to be pretty fun. I'm going to go ahead and get into it. We actually are kind of prepping this one because we have a video that we're working on in regards to the topic tonight, which is the transcendental argument, more specifically pre-suppers and how they don't really understand how logic works. But we'll get into that more. I think I'll touch upon at the end on at least what I'm working on and the contributions that me and Cease are going to make to get that video out and when to expect it. But is there anything you want to add before we actually get into the meat of it?
Yeah, so a couple of things. One, I know this is going to be a little bit technical, but hopefully we'll be able to make it make sense for everyone listening. It's one of the things that I really wanted to discuss on our channel because it's one of the primary motivators for me to have these dialogues is the presups, apologists approach to logic is something that really bothers me because I feel like I've been doing philosophy since I was 15 or 16, and I've worked really hard to try to understand these concepts and the history of it and everything that goes along with this field. And what I see from people who use these types of arguments is a total misuse of the tools, and for me, it's pseudo philosophy. It's taking things completely out of context and then expressed in such an arrogant way that anybody with even the most basic training in epistemology and in philosophy would just laugh at. But yet, it's taken seriously because most people don't put in the effort of actually learning what these things even mean and what these definitions are and what the history of these things are. So it's something that has bothered me for quite a while, and I'm excited to get a chance. And I'm sure we'll talk about it more in the future too. Like, this is something that we're going to come back to time, every once in a while. But so that's really it.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm actually see, this is like near and dear to my heart because this is something that in my own spare time I like to at least find and engage these types of people. I find it interesting. A lot of people, they really kind of poo-poo all over the precepts, and I get it for those reasons, but it's like, it's really funny kind of seeing a dog chase its tail in a sense from my perspective sometimes. And I think it's good to have the audience that's involved with listening to those conversations be part of it because they can really kind of gather what makes sense and what doesn't. I want to kind of point out that the main issue and the thing that we're going to talk about that we'll spend probably majority of the time on, inherently so because it has to do with the transcendental, argument for God, which there are multiple different ones, I suppose. They're all pretty much the same. The problem that I have off the bat, which I guess, first, before we get into that, let's start with the initial claim, the overall gist for people that might not understand what this is to put it, and from my perspective, in the best way possible. It's that only whatever worldview they come from, typically comes from the Christian worldview, only that worldview can account for what they call the logical absolutes. Now, there's problems with that in many ways. The first one I would say is that in academia, that's not even really recognized as a thing. So it's just kind of something that apologists have just dubbed logical absolutes. But in what they are in reference to is the laws of thought, that being the law of identity, non-contradiction, excluded middle. We can touch upon what that is here in a second, but what I wanted to kind of point out was how the transcendental of the argument isn't really defined. It's more of like a list of things that go with it. What's your take on that? Do you think that the transcendental part of the argument has been well defined? Do you find that as an Achilles heel? What's your take on it?
No, I don't think it's well defined, and also, I mean, it's kind of the same with, in a way, to the moral argument, which is, it's so obvious to me that it doesn't work. And in addition to what you were saying, it's just this idea that nature can only be intelligible if God is real.
Yes.
Otherwise, we have no way to sort of gather information and talk about these things. So, and I think that's so demonstrably false on so many levels that I'm excited to go through it.
Yeah, and so I want to touch on at least that first part of what the premise is, and that's we can account for the laws of logic or these transcendentals, whether they be moral facts or logical facts or any of these things. That is what is part of these transcendentals, and I have a problem with that being snuck into the premise, which is something I might touch upon in the video that we do. I think it's kind of just underhanded to sneak in the premise a category that's not very well defined, while the same type of people will kind of go, well-being, what do you mean by well-being? And then all of a sudden the definitions really matter to them when it's convenient for their position, and it doesn't when it's inconvenient for their position.
Well-being is something that we can point to that is concrete, even if it's not completely well defined. At least we have some basis to what we mean. This is just a confusion of what the tools that we're using are actually doing. And yeah, let's get into it.
Sure. So I guess we could start this off with one. They can account for the laws of logic, right? So my thing on this, and this is something we've bounced back and forth, this might go a little bit further into it right away, at least towards the tail end of it, but I think it's kind of necessary, because it's kind of the crux of it is that we can account for these absolutes, and you can't. Do you think that there's a problem in the fact that even if we say we can that it accounts for these laws of logic, let's just kind of go ahead and give them the toys that they want to play with? My perspective is that it can't account for the God's intent, its ontology. So we're still have all the work left ahead of us in defining its ontology, specifically towards like a Christian worldview or whatever it might be. And wouldn't it be subject to a God with really whatever intention it desires? Like, how do you feel about that? It seems like it leaves you with the same problem of not being able to account for the God, even if we grant it.
But the thing is, I think that's true, but I would cut down the argument even before that, where it doesn't even do that, because to even express the argument that logic comes from God, you were using logic in the first place. So they accuse us of being circular, of using our perceptions to justify themselves, to justify what it is that we're perceiving. But they're doing the same thing. They're using they're using logic to begin with to even put forth this argument and then pretend like God is primary. It's like, no, you're still starting off with the premise that with the framework of logic that you've already accepted. So it just doesn't work from the start.
Yeah, and I think the conflation that we run into off the bat is this idea of description versus prescription. So there are logic can be prescriptive, or we can have laws for ourselves in some regard that are prescriptive. It kind of governs us in some ways. You make this mistake, I feel, right off the bat with attaching that to the universe and saying that it's some kind of a prescriptive notion. And I think this kind of hits towards where you have a lot of problems in arguments in general, which is how the language is used and how it's not understood. I know I have immediate things that I could give examples of, but what would you say towards the descriptive, prescriptive aspect of these laws of logic?
Like you said, it's a complete misuse of the language. They're trying to claim that the universe is sort of subject to these laws of logic, as opposed to the laws of logic are how do I say this? Kind of models that we've constructed as a result of the consistency of existence.
Mhm.
So it's secondary.
Sure.
If it's not that the laws of logic come first and then the universe follows them. It's no, we observe the universe, and then there are certain things that through that observation, it's about how our minds are structured. And I mean, the main thing from my perspective is that there's a big difference between the law of logic and what this law refers to. So a photograph of a car is not the car. The description of a human being is not itself the human being. So the description of X does not equal X. And the laws of logic is not what is universal and contingent and invariant. The laws themselves are purely descriptions. Linguistic descriptions are secondary to the thing itself. So they are tempted to say, well, the description is mental, therefore it has to come from a mind because it's sort of abstract in this way that you can't touch, feel, or come to contact with the way that you would other things in nature. But it's completely delusional, because in reality what we're doing is we're observing the universe, we're observing the consistency of the universe and the patterns that emerge, and this logic is simply our way to make sense of the world that we experience.
Yeah.
And there's many things that we could come up with a logical syllogism that makes coherent sense but doesn't actually apply to reality. I mean, there are many reasons why logical positivism as a movement ran into some real trouble in the history of philosophy. So for now, I would just leave it at that. It's a misuse of the terminology and misunderstanding of the way these things relate to each other.
Well, and I think you made really good points, especially there's two things there. One, you talked about the contingency of the mind and how these things wouldn't be able to exist, at least from their perspective beyond that. First, before I would say that, is that if you're not familiar with what we're talking about in regards to the laws of logic, you can put this in a very simple Venn diagram. So you can put this in a circle that has A, and then on the outside of it, not A. And that is basically the Venn diagram of everything. And so essentially what you have is identity. You have whether or not it has to either be A or not A, and then the excluded middle of everything beyond those two propositions. So what you have there is basically getting to this idea with what you're saying about the contingent mind, is that you can't have these absolutes without a mind. But the problem I've run into is that you can postulate a universe, for example, with just a single object in it, right? And so with that single object, you still remain, like, the fact of identity remains. So that object, irrespective of a mind that can describe identity with the law of identity, the fact of identity in that universe remains irrespective of the descriptive element, correct? So for me, when you get into the argument on the transcendental side that says it is contingent, it is necessary, it's immediately defeated in the fact that you could use any type of, you could use a possible world argument just to show that you can have a universe that specifically has one of this only object in it that still remains the fact of identity. And I think the rebuttal to that is typically, well, but it is that object exists necessarily because of God. But at that point, all you're saying is that God just necessarily exists, and there's really no argument. It's just putting your fingers in your ear, essentially, from my perspective.
Yeah, it's just a claim, and again, there's nothing about. All you need is consciousness. All you need is the acknowledgement that the world seems to function a certain way, and we have the ability to process that information. And like you said, I mean, that's one way to approach the argument, is to say that, the object would exist on its own, regardless of a mind observing it, but the description is dependent on a mind existing. But again, the description is secondary to the actuality of the physical thing being there in the first place. So it's not that you get this abstract language from nothing that is somehow, transcending the physical. It's you're describing something that is there. And I tend to be on sort of on the school of thought that you just described. But I would add that there are those who don't even really think that when we're using logic, we're actually describing anything external to us at all. That we're just talking about the ways that our minds are structured. That there's no framework that is self-justifying.
Mm-hmm.
So logic works the moment you acknowledge, the moment you accept its premise and its framework.
Sure.
But there's always, in any case, a initial move you have to make that's perhaps not self-justifying. Now, to me, that's not a problem, because unless we're looking for certainty, the next best thing is reasonable certainty.
Well, I mean, in fairness, I would say that's how a lot of really any logic system. So I think this is what you mentioned is important here to sorry to cut you off, but to get into, in the sense of that, I think that this argument also just kind of presupposes, that this logic, that classical logic, is the right one, and that fuzzy logic, syllogistic logic, modal logic, predicate logic, any of these types of different logic systems that you can use are inherently, I guess for me, it's more so like it's inherent of it being a descriptive tool, or at least of our utility.
Right.
And if we just assume we have the same structure here, so essentially they're just arguing for a classical logic system rooted in a Judeo-Christian God. My thing is, you have the same exact problems that you have, from the perspective of having to assume it anyway. And I guess this kind of goes to whether or not you would assume it or you would have to presuppose it. I take the stance that you wouldn't have to presuppose the rules of logic. So I'd more so want to ask you, like, do you think you have to take any steps that, once you peel back these layers, so to speak, that you are assuming or presupposing in the same way that that you're referencing these logic systems?
Well, I mean, it's a little bit difficult to answer, because to some degree, initially it's intuitive. Like we don't choose that, how would I say this? That the breaking of the law of identity wouldn't make sense to us.
Mm-hmm.
It just is the case that we can't conceive of what that would mean for something to be and not to be at the same time. Okay, so in a way, it's sort of naturally the case, and intuitively so, that it seems like a necessary truth. But again, I would make a distinction between that being how our mind makes sense of things, and therefore having a certainty of what is the case external to us.
Mm-hmm.
I'm skeptical, even though, yes, obviously we have to make a first step somewhere. So I don't find the skeptic argument that interesting, because ultimately, okay, we can't have certainty, we can't have absolute knowledge, but once you take that sort of initial step of trusting that initial intuition, which we have no reason to doubt in the first place, well, then things seem to sort of come into place. Now, I'm not sure if you would call that a presupposition, or simply just going along with the intuition because we have no choice but to do that, just naturally speaking.
Would cogito ergo sum be a fair foundation, you think, for, or do you find any problem? So I know I'm kind of diverging, but it seems that if you can't account, if the argument is that you can't account for it, right? How do you view a perspective of someone that says, well, I think therefore I am. I think that in itself grounds itself in identity. I can look around, I can see other objects or whatever, and develop the descriptive tools or the language, being logic in the sense that which would encompass, the Venn diagram that I mentioned.
Yeah, I think it's self-evident, and it depends on what they mean by account for it. If you mean that if the framework is self-justifying,
mm-hmm.
beyond sort of it's self-evidently and so by what it is, what the kind of creatures that we are, and how we come into contact with reality, well, then no framework is self-justifying, including theirs. So even if I was to take that criticism, and I think that criticism is only interesting or in any way valuable if the claim we're making is to have absolute certainty, which it isn't. You don't have to. This is the other misconception that I get from theists all the time. It's like the option is either you have absolute truth or you have no grounds to say anything objective of any kind, and that's nonsense. There is a middle ground, which I call reasonable belief, which is given the tools that we have, science, math, logic, certain things appear to be self-evident. We can observe patterns in the universe. We can talk about those patterns, and we can come to certain conclusions, which, although not absolutely certain, are on better grounds than things that are not based on those observations.
Sure.
So even without certainty, you can still look at two different beliefs and say, this seems to fit the data better than another belief. If they want to ask,
well, sure. Well, how would I sorry to cut you off, but let's take any framework, like any philosophical framework, whether they were right or not. Did they not have some kind of basis that almost describes the way in which reality behaves, right? So there's always that basis for, and that's where the conflation is. So I think you kind of touched on this before, but it's like, it's not that these laws of logic inform how the way that reality behaves. It's more so that reality informs, or the way that reality behaves informs logic, which informs the logic and informs us. So
right, it's the other way around.
Yeah, exactly. So and then that's where the biggest conflation on this is that you have reality, which is going to reliably, which that's hard to say back to back, reality reliably, but reality is going to reliably behave simply because it doesn't behave any other way.
It is the case.
It just is the case. It is as simple as the tautology of reality is reality. So, and I guess to get back to what I'm saying is that even if you look at any philosophy or any worldview, an ancient worldview, anything, they all have attempts at, even if they think the world operates in a way that it doesn't, it operates in this way that you would still be able to apply a law, or you would be able to describe it in some way. You would be able to fit some form of logic system based on the faulty way that they think the reality operates, whether it be, things we can't see or whatever. You'd be able to apply that. So and I kind of wanted to hear your opinion on the like larger scale of this. And your brother is someone who probably is really good to talk to about this. But there's people that say that these can be, if it's our description, then it's subjective, right? Just like any other kind of system in the past. And we would have to have infinite knowledge basically to falsify this. Like how do you view it in the sense of like, quantum physics, where someone could try to invoke that the law of non-contradiction or identity was violated in some way? How do you view that? Does that mess up the entire thing, or is that just, hey, now we have to describe how this behaves differently?
No, I think it's just a way to describe how it behaves differently. I don't think that there is a context in which these laws do end up being broken, because we couldn't make sense, or even if they did, we wouldn't be able to make sense of it. So we have to approach it in a way that is consistent with the framework of our minds. And but again, this is the difference between the law or the description and the thing itself. We're talking about two different things. The apologists think they're talking about the thing itself when they're talking about the need for necessary God to explain these immaterial laws. But in reality, they're talking about language and its application to things that are actually concrete out there. Like I said, I just think it's working backwards, and I'm not sure to what degree. I don't know if I agree that one can construct a logic which is completely detached
from reality itself.
Yeah. I mean, perhaps I'm not sure. I think if one could, I don't know what value it would have.
Perhaps that wasn't the best thing to come out of my mouth. In hindsight, it sounded like it made sense, but yes, you would have to have I'm sure it would have to represent reality in that regard. But like, even if we take that in the sense of like, how, I guess, if you would, because I mean, from my perspective, it's not that these things in quantum, physics or anything would actually be violating. I think it's just a misunderstanding of what's going on.
Yeah, it's a lack of clarity on the terminology. I mean, when David was on, and my brother was on, he was sort of explaining that to some degree. It's like some things seem counterintuitive, and they seem to violate some of these laws, until you sort of understand the relationships among these events better and recognize that, no, you just have kind of recontextualizing what you're actually seeing, and realizing that's not really the case. Also, there's another misconception about, there's this constant misuse of the term subjective, and it's this idea that we're all experiencing different things, that we're all making sense in different ways, even in the context of morality, like we talked about, that what considers well-being is always going to be different depending on the subject. It's nonsense. It's not what the research shows. I can understand the intuition to some degree, but when you observe it in detail, you realize that there is a shared phenomenology among minds, that we tend to perceive things in a fairly similar way. Otherwise, we couldn't communicate. What is the chance that my concept of, so if I say, let's meet at a coffee shop at 3:00, okay? What is the chance that your concept in your mind of threeness, or, time, or coffee shop, or meat, is going to be subjectively so different than mine as to have entirely different definitions, and then us happen to meet in a way that works, that we can communicate and we can function, that we meet at a coffee shop at 3:00? If it was so subjective to not be able to ground it in any reasonable sense, we couldn't function. We couldn't understand each other at all. We couldn't communicate. We couldn't live in this world, if that was the case. So this is just a lazy sort of misunderstanding of language and of the way that our minds work and how we come together, and how subjectivity the collective of subjective experience can actually inform what we mean by objectivity.
Yeah, and I like to use at least the example, at least in regards to kind of understanding like how logic works in general, because it's just always a language that we're developing. Is that I look up and the first book that I see above me is Programming, Logic, and Design. So
right.
that was the first book that I had to get for my field of study, and it's no different. So the way that I kind of relate this to people, it's not entirely analogous, for sure. I mean, it's the universe versus things we've created, and I get that. But the best way to really kind of understand this concept to me is, the reality of the machine that you work with as a programmer, like the reality of it in its purest form is understood by ones and zeros. And so subsequently, we had to develop some kind of language in order to act as a descriptive map, or or a tool to kind of describe what we can do with the ones and zeros, or what the ones and zeros are doing. And these languages, they're called high-level languages, like Java or C++ or Python, or any of these high-level languages, or even assembly languages. Like, all they're doing is it's the same descript. Like, if you were to look at code and look at it, in Java, it is a descriptive element of what is going on in the reality of the placements of the ones and zeros. And so what happens is, like, what it boils down to essentially when you take this back to logic in regards to the universe, or like say the laws of thought, identity, non-contradiction, exclude middle, it boils down to what you mentioned. I call it the confusing the map of the territory for the territory itself, right?
Right.
Or a painting of a tree for what an actual tree is. And that is, in any tag debate or argument or anything you're in, that is the root of everything that is going on within what's these transcendentals. But if you zoom out and you really look at the bigger picture, it's the fact that these transcendentals aren't really well defined. It's just kind of listing things that are accepted in it, which we've graciously kind of, gone, well, we'll just give you that and we'll argue why this doesn't work for your worldview. But when you really actually zoom out and you look at these transcendentals, they're just not very well defined. I mean, it's just literally listing things and then saying the only thing that makes sense is God. It's essentially just an equals God at the end of the equation is all it is from that perspective. And I feel kind of bad in that aspect because it limits you in your understanding of even things that are most important, like math. Because once we go into like Planck time, or we get to the far as we can get back, the equations stop working. And when you understand why they don't work, it's because it's our descriptive model of reality.
It has failed, right?
And it starts to, yeah, exactly. It's when you like in the smile, I feel like you already cracked the smile, like, yeah. But people don't get that. They don't understand this very crucial concept, because without that, you don't understand what you can do to make the equation actually fit reality. And so that's the problem I find.
The thing is, people don't understand that often the case is that they think they're saying something, but they're not actually saying anything, because they don't understand the role of language.
Mm-hmm.
They don't understand what they're doing. I had a discussion with someone the other day about it was David, in fact, the theist that we had on for a second episode.
Yeah.
And he was talking about how, this doesn't exactly relate, but I'll just use it as a quick example. How God can exist outside of space and time. And my whole thing is the definition of the term existence only makes sense within the framework of space and time.
Yeah.
To take that word and take it out of its linguistic context,
it's gibberish.
It doesn't mean anything. And his response was, he tried to claim that if what I was saying was true, then the creator and the creation would exist inside of each other. So he gave the example of Steve Jobs making a computer, and he was sort of strawmanning my argument as to say that I'm claiming that Steve Jobs therefore exists in the computer, because in his mind there's like two universes there, two realities there, when it's not the case. It's one reality with two objects in it, a person and then what the person created. But it's not like you're transcending reality. Neither thing is existing outside of the context of space and time. So in that context, you can either say that God created this universe from another universe, because what he's saying is that God can't create the universe and be in the universe of this. That wouldn't make sense. But therefore, either he's already in a universe with space and time, already there, and this is just a secondary thing he's created, or you might try to say that God is everything.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Is you're a step away from just being able to say he's everything, or he can do whatever he wants, which in turn is just a step away from saying my answer is a panacea that just solves any actual problem that you can throw at me without having to explain why it solves the problem.
But also at that point, what are you really saying? Like, what does it mean for space and time, for themselves to be things that exist rather than the features that all other things need to exist? Like, the language starts breaking down when they start to come at it and approach the conversation in that way.
Yeah.
And it's like I said, it's just a confusion of the terms, and it's most mistakes, philosophically speaking, come down to a confusion of words.
Yeah, I would, and I wanted to point that out. I know I pointed out at the beginning, but I wanted to point that out now, is that it seems that a lot of the issues, kind of listening to you debate other people, I wouldn't grasp it at first, but when I would hear you be like, I think what you're engaged with is kind of like a language game, and I'd always be like, that sounds about right, but I don't think I'm fully understanding it. And the more I started getting into my studies of it, that the more that rings true so much for me, especially doing the research and fact checking for the video that we're doing. Is the more I look at these things, I'm like, damn, I mean, it all comes down to just how you can misapply language in a lot of ways. And the tag argument, I think, is the best. That and the modal ontological argument in terms of conception and probability and actuality is really what highlights that more than anything.
Those are, I think, some of the biggest flaws, and examples of a complete failure of understanding the language that you're using.
Mm-hmm.
And one particular philosopher that's been incredibly helpful as far as pointing this out is Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein. I always have trouble saying his name.
It's got a W, so I understand.
And he's been very influential as far as sort of a modern, or in some ways a postmodern understanding of the limitations of language and the limitations of what we can call knowledge. Then, of course, I think there are some people that take some of what you said to an unreasonable degree, to where now language becomes something that seems. Some people take it to a point where they'll argue that we're not really communicating at all, and I disagree with that extreme as well.
Sure. What do you think about? And so Kat's pretty much hit it on the head with. She seems to know her precepts. And so there is a part of the transcendental argument that kind of incorporates this moral, aspect to it. How would you apply it to kind of answer her question? How would you apply kind of the issues you have with their morality being kind of rooted in this transcendental for the argument?
Yeah. So if the question is, what I feel about the argument that morality, for it to exist, has to depend on God, I think we went over this to some degree when David Gonzalez was on, which is, yes, it remains a misunderstanding of language and how it relates to phenomena. The entire is-ought problem is a confusion of language. There is no is-ought problem from my point of view. Once you understand what the term ought always means in any context, which is a concern of goals, once you understand that language is secondary to phenomena, that we can break down well-being and suffering in phenomenological terms, and then discover facts about it.
Sure.
So yeah, it's the same mistake, just with different flavor. That's how I would respond to that.
Well, hey, okay, let's recap. So I know we didn't go over a lot, and we did go over a lot, but I know we didn't pick apart and go very, very specific. And the reason why we kind of just shoot the shit and going over this is that the video that we're posting up soon is more of a narrated style video. If you look at the Atheist Roundtable, there's a video I did about contradictions in the Bible. It's more along that style of narration. So though that will pick in a lot more to it, but to kind of recap on this, if you will. So the transcendental argument for God is that these transcendentals are you can't account for these transcendentals without a God. We stumbled into the problem that the transcendentals aren't very well defined, but even if we kind of grant that it refers to the laws of logic, morality, and just all these different lists of things, which I have a video that we can kind of place if you'd like. I haven't vetted it yet. We can get into that, but we'll decide that after this. When you get into the fact that their argument is that we can't account for the laws of logic, my immediate thing is that you can't account for the intent or the nature of the God, even if you could account for the fact that the God is responsible or a reflection of said logic. But the biggest problem there, without granting it, is the prescription versus description. So this is a failure to understand that the law of identity, non-contradiction, and excluded middle is a descriptive utility that we use to describe how reality behaves. So reality and the way that reality behaves informs logic, and then in turn, I'm sorry, yeah. So in turn, logic would inform us. And the argument that typically they use is that logic is informing how reality behaves, which doesn't really like. It seems like at that point, like when you're in this predicament of thinking that this is the way it is, yet you can give a very simple possible worlds argument where that one single shape existing in one universe still remains the fact that there is a fact of identity. Like the identity still exists irrespective of the mind that's able to describe it. It defeats that entire argument that it is contingent upon a mind for it to exist. Anything else you would want to add to that?
But also, you can only even make that argument if you accept the framework in the first place, which is not self-justifying. So they think they're getting at some, underneath some problem in our worldview, when in reality we both have to make an initial step, and the difference is we actually have a body of evidence and observation of the consistency of reality that we can point to. And all we need for that is the acknowledgement that we have consciousness, and reality is what it is, and we can gather information that way. And there's no problem there from a naturalistic perspective. They just have premises that they can't defend logically. They're making glaring mistakes of language and thinking that they're arriving at an indisputable conclusion, when in reality they've made a mistake every step of the way, logically speaking. I think that's, for now, it's all I can think of saying. I'm trying to think if there's anything else.
Yeah, no, and a lot of that we'll cover. I mean, we spent 44 minutes talking about that. I would.
That went by fast.
Yeah, right. Well, when you talk about nonsense, you feel it should be painstakingly like just mind numbing. But let me now, and I almost want to save this for another time, so I'll get your perspective on it. We've had more people kind of join in since we've had the discussion. Would you want to kind of go over what Jay Dyer thinks are basic transcendentals? The only problem is that it is a 10-minute long video.
I mean, I'm okay with whatever. Jay Dyer is one of those guys that I've encountered, unfortunately, a lot of trolls online that think this guy is like a genius and like worship this guy, and often like I've been told, hey, like, you should debate this guy, and I watched a couple of videos from him, and I ran into the same problems, philosophically speaking, where it's like there's nothing about what he's saying that is impressive to me.
I'll help you out. He has a master's in philosophy, and I think he doesn't know what the hell he's talking about.
Which is so depressing to me, that you can get to a point in to have that type of, where you put in that amount of time
and money
into getting a degree and money, and come out of it with such nonsense. It really is a testament to how flawed our educational system is. And I'm not trying to shit on the guy. Again, I'm sure that I would be happy to have him on and
I'm working on it, so
sort this out with him.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to attack him personally, but you can't have really observed philosophy without a bias and say the things he's saying, because it doesn't. You have to have ignored centuries of philosophy of language and epistemology to arrive at the conclusions he's making. So, that's, I think, where the bias is just operative there, where it's just like, no matter what you read, it's not going to make a difference, because I can't conceive of how someone with a master's can say those things.
Yeah, I can't conceive of the fact that, like, I watched some thing with him and T-Jump, and it was like talking about a disjunctive syllogism, and he just like didn't even understand what a disjunctive syllogism even was. Like, to the point like where it was embarrassing that in the same video he had said he had a master's in philosophy. I literally, I was just like sitting there like, Jay, I'm not on your side, but I feel really embarrassed for you.
I didn't see that one. I saw the debate he had with Dillahunty, where, I mean, it was just embarrassing from my perspective.
Yeah. I mean, that one was better in the sense of like he was calm. The one with T-Jump is a dumpster fire. So I'll leave that to you, Sisamu. We could do this in another video, in the next video, or did you want to kind of go over basic transcendentals with Jay Dyer and see what he has to think?
How's everybody in the
listening in? Yeah, I know, it's kind of where I'm at too. It's like we got.
Let's get their feedback. What would they like?
If you want to see us listen to this fucking video that we really don't want to probably listen to because it's
I'm happy listening to it, but I don't want to bore people.
Well, there's two things. One, we don't want to bore people, and two, we try to make these about an hour to an hour and a half to allow people in the future not to be like bogged down with a 2-hour video, and even an hour and a half feels like that bogs people down. But and that's what it will become if we do this. But
okay.
But I mean, I also have no problem with it. These clips will be actually part of the video that I'm using, because I'm going to be, instead of strawmanning any position that I could be accused of, the clips and the arguments are coming directly from the horse's mouth. So
let's watch a couple of clips. Just
well, okay, we'll give a dumpster fire just a little ignition, just a little bit of one.
Yeah, just as a little
of water. We'll have water nearby. How about that? Just to put it out. All right, I have share audio on.
Yeah, we don't have to watch the whole thing. Just like a couple.
Sure. Yeah, sure. And in some. I have no problem watching the whole thing. It's more so time constraints and having to pause it and go over it. The 10 minutes will turn into like 40 minutes. But
yeah, that's too much.
There is a way of seeing things right.
Volume good?
Yeah.
Awesome.
And there must be an intellect, and indeed that which contains and decrees right answers. But if there is no equivalent single soul, then the phenomenal world is always far astray. Our experience is always delusory and, by comparison, multiple and transient. If we are to believe not only that there are right answers, but that we can discover them, it must be possible for God himself, he says Zeus, he's speaking of the Greek view, to become incarnate, or for there to be someone somewhere who has the mind.
Let's go to where he actually talks about the transcendentals.
Let's look at a few.
Well, actually, can you pause?
Yeah, because it seems like he's responding. I didn't. This is what I said when I did not vet this video, so I just saw the bottom of the title, and I was like, maybe this might be something.
Okay, this is what we went over. We went over to some degree already, but right there, this idea that without this transcendental deity, the phenomenological is basically transient and escaping us and not able to be grounded in anything that we can communicate about. That's complete nonsense. There's no grounds for him to say that. Everything about our experience points to the opposite. If that was true, we couldn't communicate. If that was the case, so that's bullshit to the worst degree. Again, I don't need certainty. I don't need to know that I'm not brain in a vat to recognize the fact that even if I'm not brain in a vat, even if this is a dream, however he wants to play it, reality seems to function in a certain way that we can observe patterns, and we can talk about those patterns, and we can communicate in a way that is successful. Okay? No God is necessary for that sort of phenomena and description and understanding to take place. He would have a point if there were no patterns, if all we experienced was constant disorder, where nothing seemed to ever fit or ever be consistent, and things were constantly changing all the time without any kind of ability to ground things. But that's not the case. That's clearly not the case. So he's denying reality. And again, to have a master's in philosophy and claim that the only approach to phenomenology is one that assumes God is just fucking embarrassing. Sorry, and I try. It's hard because I don't want anybody to feel disrespected, and I would like to have him on the show. I'm not trying to attack him personally, but I can't help but internally just feel
Hey,
fury.
I'll give him a pity thumbs up. How about that? Oh,
it's really frustrating for me as someone who does this for a living to hear these kind of claims being made as though they're facts. So one is the arrogance that bothers me. Two is just the complete detachment from reality and the history of philosophy, and this is just garbage.
Well, let's dig through the trash can.
Contains and decrees right answers. But if there is no equivalent single soul, then the phenomenal world is always far astray. Our experience is always delusory and, by comparison, multiple and transient. If we are to believe not only that there are right answers, but that we can discover them, it must be possible for God himself, he says Zeus, he's speaking of the Greek view, to become incarnate, or for there to be someone somewhere who has the mind of God, and not just...
He's talking about another God, but it's okay. It still works.
An ethereal, abstract thing, but in his actual life within time and space, that's Christ. For Plotinus...
Guys, it's Christ. Duh.
The incarnation was the world soul herself in all reality, which is nonsense. At once...
But the other parts about it being Christ was not nonsense. Gotcha.
Our elder sister, Gnostic, and at the same time, the fullest expression of soul herself. But maybe there has to be a more particularized embodiment, correct, and one that can be grasped from within this synthesis. That man is a...
I don't even know what, I'm starting to zone out already.
Jay, you don't gotta...
He's reading somebody else's comment here.
Yeah, he is, but he doesn't have to... He doesn't have to do that after every time he talks. Nobody has to do that.
Each man is a microcosm of the larger. And then he
maybe it's because I'm wearing headphones, but it's just,
goes on to say that, well, we don't have this divine mind of ourselves. We get it through an incarnate God. So when you understand that, when you read my essay, and when you read the argument that Stephen Clark is making, then what we see is that it's not just a question of numbers, but all of these other things that you could list that are, you can call them transcendentals or
So we've already started with things you can list, which is what I've raised my problem with, was that defining transcendentals isn't a list of things. You have to actually give what transcendental is, not just here's a criteria of what I call transcendentals. That's not a good definition.
They derive the notion from the statement that logic and language are not things you can touch. And they're assuming that the laws themselves are immaterial forces, as opposed to purely linguistic descriptions of material things. So what they mean by the entire notion of the transcendental is based on a misconception and a misunderstanding of what is being done.
Categories or preconditions. We'll call them
It's like he's eating a Jolly Rancher while he's doing this.
transcendental preconditions. We're just going to list some. And somebody asked the other day, is there a perfect list of all of them? No. How could there be? Let's just look at a few, and we start to see that although on the surface this argument might seem really obscure, it's not.
Okay.
It's actually pretty. Man, these lights just don't work with this.
It's lagging for time.
He said the lights just don't work. Neither does your argument, Jay. But I guess we haven't gotten there yet. That's fine.
So let's take
time and
the first one.
space. Time and space. Self. Is that Waldo?
Words meaning.
Okay, I don't know what the fuck that says.
The past? Is that what it says?
I think that's the past. Universals and ethics. So
There is nothing transcendent about any of those things. Every single one can be broken down in purely physical...
except for Waldo, because I can't find him. That's
yeah,
it.
except for Waldo. Cause, no, that's. I mean, it's just. Yeah, I would say let's leave it at that for now. Honestly, we can have like another episode where we just go through like an entire one of his videos.
Well, sure. Let me just take a little peek for the next we'll do this
The
as
next part.
the next little sneak peek for the next episode, and we can get into this, and perhaps maybe you'll see this on the new video.
Time and space. Okay. Now this is a transcendental category that you
Category. So not an actual. We're never going to describe transcendental. We're just going to list things. What if you go back and rewind from the beginning of this video? That's what I said. What was one of the initial problems?
cannot empirically verify. And don't give me the low IQ reply of, well, I have a watch. Your watch is not the same thing as time itself. Time itself is
You can't
some
empirically
kind
verify
of
it.
abstract category. Doesn't matter what you want to define it as. Point is that it's not proven to exist merely by empirical investigation.
Right? I pause it.
I'm sorry. What was that statement that he just said?
He just ignored the entirety of modern physics.
I literally was like, where's your brother's number? I have it on.
I know, like that's actually
here somewhere. Like, oh my god. So not only do we need to have Jay have a conversation with you, we got to have him have a conversation with the physicist. Okay, cool. We can do that.
I mean, and also it's weird that because I would have imagined that the transcendent to be the category. So why is he saying that all these things in the list are their own category? Or am I misunderstanding?
Well, so that's what makes up these transcendentals, right? He can essentially derive as many what he would call abstract categories or concepts together into this one category, because the way he's it's a category fallacy, but the way he's categorizing all these things is it's also a equivocation fallacy, but the way that he's categorizing these things is just it's almost like, let's put everything I can't explain or that I don't understand it has a descriptive element to it. Let's throw it in the hat of things I can't explain, even though it's part of the description. Like that's what.
But the thing is, everything that he just listed has entirely a concrete description of what it is that we can mean by those things. None of that requires any metaphysical or supernatural claim to be made.
Yeah.
I don't understand how he's even arriving at any of, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, and with that, we will we'll conclude the Jay Dyer part for now. So the Jay Dyer.
We can return to this at some point when we have more time.
The Jay Dyer minions, hold your pants up. We will be back on this. No problem at all there. But what the main reason is we try to keep these to about an hour. So this wasn't supposed to be a clip show, but we can use that as a reference for the next one. I have 2 theists that are supposed to come on. Hopefully I can get them both on. It will be another Cease and whoever that theist happens to be at the time discussion. I'll get on a discussion with somebody here as well, probably more so around biblical scripture. for the time being, in case you guys kind of want to know how things will be kind of divvied up, I'm going to have Cease dealing with predominantly majority of a lot of the philosophy and these types of arguments. And then for now, I'm gonna go with maybe some more of the biblical arguments and things like that. But eventually, we will hopefully have enough guests to come in to make this cyclical in a sense of getting Max on and other people that we have involved in this. But for now, hopefully we get Adam Rich on to talk to you. And anything that you want to add before we close it out tonight?
No, I hope people enjoyed. I know some of the stuff was a little bit technical and probably not, super interesting, but I think it's important to shed light on some of these arguments, even though they're awful, because we're trying to fight bad ideas here.
Yep. And
these are really bad ideas, and they make a mockery out of things that I care about. And so I'm glad that we got a chance to talk about it a little bit.
Yeah, and in the future, when we this is our first time really just shooting the shit, so to speak, and just going over them, off the cuff. I know Cease isn't, at least from my perspective, I don't think you're going down and typing up a big document, or neither am I before we actually get into these things. It's just going off the top of our head. But what I would like to do in the future, when I know, so Cease goes through finishing up his degree with philosophy, I'm finishing up my degree, and then I'm pursuing computational biology. I'm trying to do a lot myself, but in the downtimes, once this starts to get a little easier for us to put out content more consistently, my goal here is to actually break down these arguments, hence the name Axioms on Trial, in a very, very specific and very almost not redundant by any means, but just we're gonna peel back every possible layer that you can peel back.
This is just a little taste of what's to come.
Sure. And so be on the watch out. Our first video will probably appear about after three or four more live episodes that we'll do. So I would say be on the lookout of that for either in a week or the next 2 weeks. That should be released, and that will be the precept problem, which tackles the inherent problems that precepts usually give, and then more specifically, it'll go into the tag argument as well. So we appreciate it, and we love you guys all. We love all of you guys. I'm sorry, I can't speak. It's getting kind of late. But one thing I want to mention irrelevant is that football starts tomorrow. And if you know anything about me, I love fantasy football. And so go Falcons and go my team.
I know nothing of football. MMA is my sport. I know nothing about the sport.
Actually, and that's another thing that me and Cease might be working on is, if you guys are UFC fans, we might be starting a new podcast, just once a week kind of a thing with UFC with a friend of mine, where Cease and him are probably more aligned with the knowledge of UFC, whereas I'm learning. So it'll be a really cool perspective of having a person that doesn't really understand it as well, but giving their thoughts as a noob, and then hearing the more of like the veteran kind of perspective of what they think about those takes. So it'll be fun.
I watch MMA religiously, so to speak. I love it. So. Yeah.
And quick shout out to Kat the Humanist, Geo Sam, Pasta Mike, Murder Shed Steve. I wanted to just say Steve, but I was like, I gotta get the gimmick right. Oz, Jeff, everybody that supports us. They're always
Thank you guys.
And we love you guys very much. Peace out, and hopefully Le'Veon Bell goes for like 4 touchdowns tomorrow. Peace.
See you next time.